Hello students, welcome to my lecture. Today's theme of discussion is globalization and liberalization. I'm sure you are all familiar with this name. In fact, it is an issue which has been in the focus of academic as well as popular discussion for nearly 2.5 decades. In fact, it is a much debated and much discussed issue. So we will actually try to explain in some detail what is globalization, what does the concept really mean, what are its features, what are its advantages or plus sides, what are its disadvantages and minus sides, and finally, how it impacts on the most important actor in international relations today, namely the nation state. In other words, how it affects the state itself, its functioning, its sovereignty, its identity, and so on and so forth. In fact, as I just mentioned, that it is a very contested concept. In fact, there is no agreement among scholars about the nature of globalization and also its definition. Some scholars have tried to give a very basic understanding, and frankly speaking, let me start with that very basic understanding that what it actually means. Basically, it is a process of transformation touching upon every aspect of social, political, and economic developments around the globe. The population of the world is increasingly bonded into a single society. On the social front, there is closer interaction of people, there is homogenization of culture. Homogenization means that cultures are being increasingly integrated, that is, the cultural values of one society are being adopted by another society. That is what homogenization means, and also values. And the world is becoming a global village. Politically, it is a complex network of global governance, shared political values, which again is leading to homogenization of global political culture. I'm sure you are familiar with the word political culture. Political culture essentially means certain values, beliefs, principles associated with the political dynamics of a particular country. Economically, it essentially means liberalization of economies, liberalization tendencies, privatization, deregulation, which leads to free market regime. And it challenges, all these things actually challenges the raison d'etre of states, which, as I just mentioned, still continue to be the dominant actors of international relations. I think we can now attempt to characterize the term globalization. What exactly does it mean? How do we define globalization? I have just explained to you actually in broadest possible terms what it actually means. But let us try and attempt some definitions. Now, of course, there are interminable definitions and variations of the theme. So therefore, as I said right at the beginning, that there is no consensus among writers as to what it means. Now, according to some writers, globalization is essentially a multifaceted phenomenon impacting on social, economic, and political spheres of human experience. Others, that is another group of writers and scholars, they actually argue that globalization is essentially a set of phenomena that accompany one another without any particular aspect being more important or significant than others. For instance, the political aspect is not more important, or the economic aspect is not more important, or the social aspect is not important. They are actually impacting almost parallelly on states and societies and international relations on the other. In fact, here, normally what happens is that there is a tendency to emphasize the revolution in the field of communications technology and so on and so forth, and this group of thinkers argue that actually it is this revolution in communications technology which have expedited, which has brought about globalization and which has expedited globalization. In fact, this is something that I'm going to discuss in greater detail as we go along. But I was talking about this other group of writers who actually argue that globalization essentially has impacted primarily on economics and politics. However, the root foundation of course, as I just mentioned, is in the advancement of global communication networks. Now, this communication revolution is something with which I'm sure you are all familiar. We are talking about satellite television, internet, the social media, mobile phones, and so on and so forth. Your generation is particularly familiar with this. This revolution really has taken place in the last 20 or 25 years or so. In our younger days, we could not imagine, for instance, watching something on television. Of course, there was no television in those days. Watching something on television that was taking place in the other part of the world. So I'm sure you can understand, and I'm sure many of you are also familiar with the internet. Not only familiar, actually you are actively using it, and you are also active on the social media. So you can very well imagine how ideas, information, and cultural values actually, really transcend. That is, communicate. That is, travel beyond the nation-state boundaries. And this, in its consequence, triggers new social and political dynamics across the world. There is also another group of writers and thinkers who emphasize solely on the economic character of globalization. That is, they argue that globalization is essentially an economic phenomenon. That is, in other words, they argue that it is actually leading to an interconnected world market. That is, in other words, different countries, through their liberalization of trade, capital investment, and movement of services across the world, they are actually getting access to other markets, other countries, the economies of other countries, where actually, this is just actually basically what it means is that, if a particular country has surplus capital or surplus goods or services, then this country, for instance, would be looking for markets. Now, this has become much easier. After the end of the Second World War, in fact, international trade actually was not very free, but now it is becoming increasingly more free. So therefore, this particular aspect of globalization characterizes it with free market capitalism. That is, in other words, it simply means that it is a powerful vehicle that raises economic growth, spreads technology, which in turn actually leads to better living standards in both developed and developing countries. So globalization is not a social and economic theory alone, but also a new dynamic social reality carrying deep implications. In simple language, globalization signifies opening up or interconnectedness. I'm sure you understand these terms. They are quite simple. It simply means that the world is more networked than it was earlier, and this networking has been possible primarily because of the revolution in technologies, particularly in communication technologies. So we have the image of a world which is a global village, as I already mentioned this term earlier, largely unhindered by geographical distances, time zones, or other physical barriers to movement between the countries. I'm sure you understand what I'm really trying to convey here. It simply means that the distances, the geographical distances among the countries actually have now become increasingly irrelevant. It is now possible, for instance, not only to travel from one country to another with considerable ease, but if you are not traveling, you are actually, for instance, you are located, you are based in a particular city, and you want to know what is happening in other countries. You have access to instruments, you have access to devices through which you can do that. As I already mentioned, that through satellite television, for instance, you can keep track of what is happening in other parts of the world, whether it is in the field of politics, in the field of cinema, in the field of art, in the field of sports, in the field of culture, whatever it may be. You have, in other words, you have the world in your drawing room, and of course, the benefits of internet are well known. Through internet, actually, you can communicate with people who are based or located in maybe the other part of the world. Actually, previously you had to use letters, which would take days to travel. Today, through electronic mail, you are able to actually send your message almost instantly. And there is the mobile phone through which you can also instantly communicate with friends and relatives and others who might be based in other parts of the world. So what I'm trying to say is that these physical geographical barriers have now disappeared, because of and this has actually in its turn has expedited the process of globalization. Now let us take up the basic features of globalization. I'm sure some of these might already be evident to you from what I have discussed, but let me go into some detail. Now, as I have already mentioned, that it is characterized by liberalization, privatization, free trade, deregulation of tariff barriers, internationalization of national economies, global movement of capital, information and technology, increased activities of economic and political organizations, and rapid growth in globalized social movements. All these things are happening at the same time. In fact, I would like to go into greater detail. Particularly, this is a phenomenon which has been described by scholars as deterritorialization. Deterritorialization. That means territory, as I have just explained in some detail, that this means that territory is no longer as important as it used to be, even say 30 years ago. Geography is now less important. In regard to how people live, how people work, how people interact. There is increasing flow of trade, capital, and information, and mobility of individuals across borders, which I have also just referred to. So therefore, keeping all these things in mind, actually, things that are happening around the globe, we can identify the following features. Firstly, opening up of national economies to foreign capital and technologies. That is, in other words, economies are now increasingly liberalizing. Previously, economies were, more protection oriented. That is, in other words, that they would not allow foreign goods and services and capital very easily, but they are now having to do so. Some willingly, some unwillingly. Then that, of course, leads to efforts to integrate national economies with the global economy. In fact, this is a very important question. I mean, to what degree your economy is integrated with the world? Of course, it has its plus points as well as the minus points. Then there is, of course, free trade, which I have already referred to, and removal of tariff barriers. That is, I'm sure you understand what it means, tariff barriers. Tariff barriers means taxes, which are imposed on goods and services which are coming from outside the country. Now, these taxes or tariffs actually are now being increasingly reduced. And in fact, the idea of free trade, that is trade without any tariff barriers, in fact, is gaining momentum. Then, privatization, of course, is very important to liberalization. If you do not liberalize, then of course, you will not get the benefit of the free flow of goods and services and capital and investment that you would normally expect. There is, in fact, less and less control over ownership of means of production, distribution, and exchange. Now, there is increased proliferation of agents of globalization. Now, what do I mean by the agents of globalization? Basically, what I mean is that, I'm sure you are familiar with the concept multinational corporations. What are multinational corporations? Multinational corporations are corporations which may have their headquarters in a particular country, but their activities are spread throughout the world, or maybe in large parts of the world. So therefore, these multinational corporations, or sometimes they are referred to as transnational corporations, they are also very active, because they are playing an increasing role increasing international trade and financial institutions. Particularly, I am referring to the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Bank. These international institutions also are playing a more important role, a greater role than they were playing actually earlier. Now, I have already referred to the information and technological revolution. In fact, I can probably do by repeating what I have already said, that it has led to, this information revolution has led to a sea change in modes of communication. And this means actually a fast movement of capital, goods, information, and people. In fact, today people are moving across the world. Information is moving across the world. Capital is moving across the world as fast like nothing seen before in the history of mankind. In fact, there are a greater number of actors and networks in today's world, quantitatively much greater than in the past, as I mentioned. Now, and there is also the impact of each other, on so far as these particular actors are concerned, and I've already referred to the transnational corporations, their activities, and their products. Now, deterritorialization is something I have already referred to. This again means that the global stock and bond trading, migration, fixation of international financial and exchange rate transactions has led to irrelevance of geography. Now, the financial flows across the borders actually is almost unprecedented, and I'm sure if you keep your eyes on the television, on the screens of television, actually you could not have failed to have noticed that if stock markets in a particular area of the world, for instance, are behaving in a particular manner, then the stock markets in other parts of the world actually would also follow suit. That means actually if stock markets are, if stock prices are going up, say in America or in Western Europe, in fact stock prices in Asia also would go up, and this will also affect, for instance, the Indian stock market. The same applies to bond markets as well. Now, yet another dimension of globalization is, of course, social movements. Now, I've already referred to it, that is the movement of people and so on and so forth. But now I am referring more to social movements in the sense of civic activism and movements. Like, for instance, human rights, women's issues, environmental issues. You might have heard of an environmental group called the Greenpeace, which is actually an international, NGO, non-governmental organization, and their basic objective, of course, is to ensure that environmental degradation be kept down to its minimum possible. And apart from this, there are other environmental movements as well. Then, of course, there is the effort to control diseases. In fact, interestingly, globalization has not remained confined only to globalization of politics, economics, society, and so on and so forth. It has also led to globalization of diseases. In fact, diseases are no longer actually contained. Previously, you can say that maybe 50 or 100 years ago, if a particular disease was prevalent primarily in a particular zone of the world, chances were that this would not spread to other parts of the world, because the movement of people, for instance, was much more restricted, and so on and so forth. But today, that is no longer the case, and particularly communicable diseases, that is, in other words, diseases actually which, people carry, like HIV, AIDS, and other deadly diseases, communicable diseases. These are actually spreading to other parts of the world because of the fast movement of people as well as other kinds of movements. And today you also have international organizations, who are working to contain. These are, for instance, I can give you the name of a French, organization called Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières. They are actually, these are doctors who work across the world. Then, of course, I have already mentioned global governance, particularly through the international agencies like United Nations, then regional agencies like European Union, ASEAN, etc., and so on and so forth. So I think, it is quite clear from what I have said in the last so many minutes. There are three things which are very clear. One is that globalization is a process which requires a response. At the same time, actually, it is necessary to make it clear that it is not a process which is being directed by any particular state or any particular government and so on and so forth. Although actually critics of globalization, to which I will come later, they argue that actually this process is primarily controlled and driven by more powerful countries, richer countries, and so on and so forth. But it is not entirely true. Secondly, the nation state, I'm going to talk about this in some detail later. The nation state is no longer the sole actor in international relations. It has to share the world stage with others. International relations today is less nation state centric than it used to be. So these are actually generally referred to as non-state actors. And finally, in fact, it is globalization actually identifies or denotes the unsustainable character of traditional distinction between domestic and international spheres. Previously, actually, we could smugly assume that the domestic sphere was much more insulated from international influences, international affairs, and so on and so forth. But that is no longer so. Today, the domestic sphere actually is being affected, is being influenced, is being shaped in various ways from external influences and external factors than it was in the previous years that we have noticed.